This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy, two great comedy stars right now at radically different points in their film careers. Murphy's career taking off at age 22, and Pryor having tasted both success and tragedy at age 42. And the varied film careers of Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy, the two hottest comedy talents in the movies today, is the subject of this special edition of At the Movies. Joining me in the balcony is Roger Ebert, film critic of the Chicago Sun-Times.
And across the aisle from me is Gene Siskel, film critic of the Chicago Tribune.
And I'm Antonio, host of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast, here with my co-host,
Justin Henson of the Movie Wire.
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. You know, I never really thought about all the little special episodes that Siskel and Ebert did, apart from their review episodes and then our favorites, the best of, the worst of, and the memo to the academies. You know, if we picked the Oscars, this is who we would pick. But every once in a while, and sometimes they did it solo, they would do these special episodes on, let's say, what's hot at the moment. You know, to me, the one that I remember seeing in person live was the Pulp Fiction episode, where it's like they gave Tarantino all of his laurels and told him that he was changing the industry and just really diving deep into that film and what they thought the future of cinema and independent cinema looked like based off of Pulp Fiction's success. That's like the one I remember seeing, like, yeah, talk more about Pulp Fiction. But as I went back to these archives, man, they did a lot of these special episodes where they were talking either about directors. There's one that we'll get to eventually, will VHS ruin movies? And then they changed their tune about that several years later. But we were going to talk about The Toy with Richard Pryor. And they didn't do a full review on that, but instead they did this. It was an introduction to the cinema of Eddie Murphy, 1982. He'd done two movies, and in a way, it feels like they were talking about Richard Pryor's career waning as Eddie Murphy's was rising, and what that was going to look like for the future of these comedians. And so we decided to take a stab at that. Now, what were your thoughts on this special episode and some of the opinions that they had?
Now, one thing we kind of forget with these special episodes is Siskel and Ebert, they were shoulder to shoulder with some of these big names. I mean, they interviewed these solo, as we'll kind of get into in this episode. Gene Siskel, interviewed Eddie Murphy at one point, Richard Pryor, Roger Ebert, again, really close to Martin Scorsese. So These are a couple of critics that really, I think, with these special episodes, got some inspiration from Hollywood and their interviews to really create these. And I think this is a good matchup because going down the rabbit hole after watching their thoughts on Pryor and Murphy, there's a lot to this story that we can pick apart. And there's a lot to these two talents that they get right to some aspects, and there's some that I actually were passionately in disagreement with. But when it comes down to it, I love these special episodes because not only do we get a shining light on their opinions, but we get a shining light on their entry into Hollywood, on what inspires them as critics to create these episodes. So it's a looking glass into the talent, the topic, and the critics. So I think this is a great pick from you on covering this for this special episode. So I'm excited about this one.
Going back into the archives of their show, like when you look at the ones from like the mid to late 70s that were on the public access on the local Chicago station, they hadn't really tasted success yet. They were still very localized. They weren't rubbing elbows with celebrities. They weren't held in that, oh my God, my film career is over if these two don't like my movie. And at this point in the early 80s, they were kind of there. They were starting to get more recognition on TV. They had already put out some books. Their articles were worldwide. So it felt like they did have a lot more credibility in making calls like this in people's careers. Now, we'll get into it as I play some of these clips, but one of the things I have to mention about this is there was some weird reason why people thought that these two guys held some kind of like prophetic abilities, right? Almost as if they were kind of calling the shots or they were like handicapping the industry before things actually happened. We've seen that fail many times as we've been doing this podcast, reviewing these episodes and looking at their reviews of like, okay, which films did they think were going to crash and burn and be forgotten, but are now kind of cemented in history? You know, that's what the thing where I love this topic, this podcast that we do, because you and I have just the utmost respect for these guys as critics. But sometimes when they stepped outside of their critic circle and maybe thought they were just a little bit too involved with the industry than they really were, that's where I think some of the mistakes and some of the opinions that changed over time can definitely be recognized. But people don't really look at them for that because they didn't do it all the time. When they did, it was in an episode like this or in an interview off the show where they really said some outlandish things. But again, that's being a celebrity, right? You say outlandish things all the time. You're a Hollywood insider, so to speak. But as time goes by, hey, some things might hold truth, but a lot of it just kind of is nonsense.
Yeah, well, and that's a part of being a journalist too in that mix.
Yeah.
Where you really have your opinion and you get into that habit of voicing your opinion on it. I mean, there's an episode where Gene tells a story of meeting I won't name the celebrity, but meeting a celebrity at a pool, and he wouldn't even acknowledge Gene because he left a bad review. So this is how personal I think sometimes journalists put into their critics, where we start to question what their intent was, because the next following 2-3 movies after this meeting, he gave a negative review and Roger actually gave a positive review. So there's a lot to this that could be a danger to critics on advertising how much we're involved into Hollywood or what celebrities that we've interviewed, because we can kind of see that shine. And I know we talked about Quentin Tarantino numerous times where they do talk about him a little bit differently than what other celebrities do. And they did interview Quentin Tarantino, but they saw the talent from the beginning. And there's a different light that we see when they talk about Tarantino versus, say, Martin Scorsese versus Spielberg. So there's different dynamics to their interactions and how they interview and how they talk about these celebrities in these special episodes. So I think when it comes to their journalistic instincts, that's what really shines through when it comes to how they talk about it and on video here. So, and I think with Pryor, we see that too.
Absolutely. So let's hear some of the first things they have to say.
On this program, we're going to be talking about where they came from, what they do best, and how they could screw it up if they play things too safe.
Gene is predicting the downfall of one, while Roger is predicting the meteoric rise of the other. But the one thing that Roger really doesn't want either of them to do is to play things too safe. That's a very prophetic response from him, because I think that is the biggest complaint about fans of Eddie Murphy. Not so much Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor went a different direction later on. But there was a point once Eddie Murphy hit a certain level of success where he did just take a lot of safe roles, and they've kind of buried him. And I really feel bad because he has released some really great content in the last 10 years, but it just can't break through the stigma that he created of all those multi-million dollar budget projects of him in different prosthetics as different characters, PG-13 rated comedies that just really weren't that funny. But also, he completely washed away the whole idea that he was a stand-up comic. He kind of just wiped it away and said, no, I'm an actor now. I'm a performer. I'm not the Saturday Night Live guy anymore. and I'm not the stand-up comic anymore. Where we'll get to it in a second, they honestly believe that that is where a lot of his raw energy came from, was always being on when you were a stand-up comic or a live performer, like on a Saturday Night Live TV show, and then you bring that energy to your movie, but then you get that out of your life and you just start focusing on easy, safe projects, and you see yourself start to mellow down, and people start to lose the respect they had for you and the energy that you brought them and the joy that you brought them.
There's a comment that Ebert makes, and I'm going to wait for this one because this one is going to be a bigger discussion. But you're absolutely right, because we take a look at Pryor's rise his safe roles, if I were to talk Siskel and Ebert language here, in the 80s, where it was a decline in the safe roles, if you want to call them. And that's when Murphy really just did take off with his roles. But the crossroads here was Harlem Nights. This was the pivotal movie that's going to affect both Pryor and Murphy's career, because this was, again, the height of Murphy's confidence, where he wrote, directed, and starred in this movie with Pryor in it as well. And you see both of these talents, kind of, one with Pryor taking almost a step back, taking it easy with the roles that he takes. And you have Murphy.
Passing of the torch.
Yeah, and then you have Murphy that's just taking all these random roles. There's no rhyme or reason to what he's picking. From The Distinguished Gentleman to Boomerang to Nutty Professor to The Fantastic Movie of Life, it was a mixed bag. And this was, I think, the safeness that we saw going forward in his career, that Harlem Nights, to both of these talents, really did almost, I don't want to assume, but took them almost down a notch to where they almost either kind of stepped away from the limelight or just took whatever they could. So to me, I find it very interesting that this movie affected both of these shining talents at this time, these well-respected comedians. And Harlem Nights, to me, isn't a bad movie. I really enjoyed it.
It had its moments. You shot me in my pinky toe. I laugh every time.
But it's something that wasn't ready for these two gigantic comedic talents to be on screen together. It's not what audiences expected. And this is what I think really affected these two on where they were going to go in their careers.
I agree with you. It is a big move to do a film like that, a passion project, when you are at the height of your popularity, in Eddie Murphy's case. You know, to me, that seems like something that you would do as your star has started to wane a little bit, which that I agree with you 100%. Harlem Nights was kind of like the crossroads for him. And Pryor, you could already tell his health was starting to decline. You definitely see it in Another You, his last collaboration with Gene Wilder. And then you just see him in wheelchairs in films after that. Very sad. But one of the things, too, I think that I enjoy about this conversation is that Pryor and Murphy were friends in real life. Murphy looked at Pryor as like a mentor. I believe it's in his special Raw, which is like one of my favorite comedy stand-up concert films of all time, where he talks about Bill Cosby saying that he was too vulgar and you can't say fuck on stage. And then he called Richard Pryor and he's like, well, tell Bill to shut the fuck up. You could tell that they were in the same type of comedic grounding. They were both very open with their language, open with their dialogue, open with the cultural references. They had no problem speaking about race, derogatory statements about race, both them and other races, because no one else was doing it at the time. Lenny Bruce did it back in the 60s, but those two were the ones that really focused on it. Everyone else was kind of afraid for a while to do it, and so let them handle it. When that translates into a movie career, Pryor was like on the right note. Do these vulgar black comedies, these grindhouse movies, these low-budget comedies, and then when you get paired up with someone like Gene Wilder, stir crazy. It's one of the funniest movies of all time, and they're both off the hook. They're let loose on that one, and that's why it's funny. When you see them restrained in the future, it's exactly what Gene and Roger are talking about, where, okay, well, now we're seeing them play it safe, and we're not getting the laughs that we used to. Where Murphy, we got a good decade and a half of laughs before we started seeing that energy decline. They continue.
Very hard to hold center stage all alone in the movies. Barbra Streisand can do it when she sings, and Richard Pryor can do it there when he's talking about his life. But then the list gets awfully short after that.
I don't know of anybody else who's a comedian who's done a concert film unless you go all the way back to some of those documentaries about Lenny Bruce in the 1960s.
Right.
And very few stand-up comedians could carry a film like that.
It's absolutely true. Now, the following year, in 1980, Pryor had his biggest mainstream commercial success, playing to a huge black and white audience in the comedy Stir Crazy, with Pryor and Gene Wilder playing a couple of drifters who bumble their way into being sentenced to jail.
Okay, so speaking about Pryor's big screen comedic stand-up performances, there was Live on the Sunset Strip and Live in Concert, both absolutely hilarious and both really, really classic, both very vulgar, both very open, but very honest films. And we hadn't seen a lot of stand-up concerts at that point, and that's what Roger was trying to say. It's like, okay, well, we've seen Barbra Streisand hold the audience's attention for an hour and a half. Richard Pryor just did it. Delirious hadn't come out yet. Raw hadn't come out yet, so we hadn't seen Eddie Murphy do it, but he could do it too. Do you like the film Silver Streak?
Love Silver Streak.
I love Silver Streak too. It is not stir crazy by any means. It's more of a Hitchcock kind of play, and I covered it on the Cult Worthy, but that is the first time where we see the chemistry between Wilder and Pryor, but it's not vulgar. It's hilarious because they make it hilarious. They had great timing together. So Stir Crazy, I think, was the perfect opportunity for them to show what they could do with their comedic chops. And at this point in his career, it probably was Pryor's proudest moment. We hadn't gotten to some of the other films in the 80s at this point, but that's the one that they're definitely hanging their hat on. What about Stir Crazy? You a fan of that one, I'm sure.
100%. So one of my favorites on it. And the thing with this is like the Walter Matthau, Jack Lemmon partnership, where it just works. These two knew it when they were on set together. And this is one of those partnerships that, when you think of comedic partnerships, these two just work. And I can't think of another pair that does it better, even till their last screen, which is one of my personal favorites, even though it's debatable, which is See No Evil, Hear No Evil. But their partnership is uncanny.
They don't really share any similar backgrounds in performance. Pryor was a stand-up comic, did some TV work, trying to be the next Bill Cosby, and then it's like, screw it, I'm just going to speak my mind, and it gets him into this career, where Gene Wilder was a theater guy, a respectable theater guy who found his way into comedy and Mel Brooks movies, and somehow those two just work really well together. Now, at this point, Eddie Murphy had done two movies. He had done 48 Hours, which he was 21 years old when he got that role, and then Trading Places. And Trading Places is like fresh when they're doing this particular episode. And I'll get to it in a little bit, but they are really the perfect introduction to an energy and a talent like Murphy, where 48 Hours, it's an action film, it's a Walter Hill movie, but it really is one of the primordial buddy cop movies, right? He's not a cop, but Nolte's the cop. You've got the crazy guy, and you've got the hard-nosed cop, and we've seen that dynamic done over and over again. But doing like the black and white, the salt and pepper, the funny, and the gruff, I mean, you don't get gruffer than Nick Nolte at all. And it worked. It was a box office smash. Then pairing him up with Dan Aykroyd in Trading Places, where now you've got two comedic talents, both from the same world, the world of sketch, the world of Saturday Night Live, being directed by John Landis with a great script, not afraid to tackle the racial issues. Again, it's one of those movies where people say, oh, could it be made these days? Get out of here with that. It was perfect for its time. You could totally do it, but you just have to have the balls to do it. But we hadn't even gotten to his best works yet, and already they're talking about him in this special.
Well, the one thing that, if we were to take a step back, I mean, here's the yin and the yang of it. So the movies always have to have a contrasting character. So obviously that happens, that works. But when we look at Pryor and Wilder, or even Nolte and Murphy, two completely different personalities, not the characters, but personalities that really interact with each other on a different level. And we talk about the likability piece of it. When we go back to their stand-up, there's one important thing that Gene speaks to later is one, you can tell when somebody's a star because when they look into the camera, you follow with them. And we talk about Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor in the early years. They've earned that likability. They do it in different ways with their stand-up, but they've earned the content of which the vulgar content that they speak to. It's real, but
Right.
it's likable. You have Pryor that shines his smile when he tells a joke, and you have Murphy that goes 100 miles an hour in his delivery. So these are two that handle comedy in a different way, even though the subject matter is there, but they bring that. They don't try and change each other's style. They don't change their style in the movie. They take their unique dynamic and put it in the character. The character doesn't change them. And that's what I really appreciate about both Murphy and Pryor in the early years is when you go to a Pryor movie, you're not going to get much difference of a character. You're there to see Pryor. You're there to see him in different situations. It's like watching old uh, silent comedies. You go to see Chaplin. He's not changing the character. It's still Chaplin. You're just going to see him in a different environment and what silly things he's going to do next. It's the same thing
Right.
when we get with Pryor. And that's what I really do love about watching every single moment of what he does on screen. And Gene is absolutely right because we do follow Pryor and Murphy to an extent of what they do in front of the camera. They rule the camera and they run the movie.
Obviously those scripts were not written that way. They were written to be sidekicks. And that's one of the things they mentioned later is like, well, we hope that they don't just get stuck in this role of being the sidekick. I took a little bit of offense to that comment because 48 hours, I feel, isn't a sidekick situation. I feel that Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte both star in that movie, and they both bring very important energy to that film. Trading Places even more so. There's more screen time for Eddie Murphy than there is Dan Aykroyd in that film. You might not think of it because, hey, Dan Aykroyd's the white guy, but all the best moments, all of the funniest scenes are all given to Murphy, and that's totally intentional because at that point they knew what they had. So calling him a sidekick in that one, I disagree. If anything, in my opinion, Aykroyd's the sidekick. Might be controversial, but I think when you consider performance, screen time, and the more memorable scenes, other than Aykroyd eating a piece of salmon through a dirty Santa Claus beard on the bus, all the best moments belong to Murphy in that movie.
That's one of my favorite scenes of Trading Places, by the way. But you're 100% right because Eddie Murphy, they know what this talent is. And again, whether there was a lot of rewrites or not, I don't know. But here's the deal. He should be the focal character because he's the most interesting character. Not to say that the Aykroyd character isn't interesting, but we want to see a success story. We want to see this character rise. We want to see him succeed,
Right.
other than the rich guy that does the reverse. We don't want to see a rich guy necessarily win. We're going to root for Murphy on it. And it's the way, and it's a challenging role. And if anybody says differently, they're wrong because it is, because this is where the likability really takes charge. If you don't have likability in the Murphy character, you're not going to have a good movie. And they were right. And I applaud them for taking the risk to give that much screen time. But when you go and ask anybody about 48 hours and you just mention that movie, I doubt it. The first name that's going to come out of their mouth is Nick Nolte because it is
Right.
48 hours. It's an Eddie Murphy movie. Nick
It's an
Nolte does
Eddie
a great
Murphy
job.
movie.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's one of those that, again, he runs the camera on both of those because he is the focal point, because he makes sure that he is the focal point, and that's what led to his success. We don't see that in the 90s when he goes into movies. That's where him and Pryor really separate themselves on their style because Murphy ended up showing off his talents with the Nutty Professor and numerous characters. That's a different kind of Murphy that we got from his early stuff. So to me, Pryor is more classical when it comes to that. Eddie is more creative when it comes to how he pushes himself forward. Sometimes successful, sometimes not. But at the same time, the style is going to be different. But again, these two own the camera. That's why when you mention these movies, that's the name that's going to pop up with both of these beautiful talents.
One of the problems, though, is that sometimes there's a very thin line between rebellion and self-destruction. Richard Pryor's career was skyrocketing when near tragedy struck on June the 9th, 1980, when Pryor, who was reportedly freebasing cocaine, was severely burned over half of his body. And for a while it was touch and go whether Pryor would live or not, but he did recover. When he returned to performing, he was a little more thoughtful. He said he was off the drugs, but he still had the ability to laugh at himself and at his weaknesses. And in an amazing concert film called Richard Pryor Live on the Sunset Strip, he was able to joke about the fire.
So it's interesting that he says that, because one of the points he makes is that after the incident where Richard Pryor burnt himself up, which is actually one of the funniest jokes in the Live on the Sunset Strip film, is like, what do you call this? And he runs it around. He's like, Richard Pryor running down the street on fire. Like, he can take that kind of self-deprecating humor on himself. But I disagree about him trying to play it safe after that incident, because what they didn't do, and this was really upsetting to me, is they did not mention his 1978 performance in Blue Collar, where he plays a very dramatic role, and he pulls it off. It's been highly regarded in the industry that the reason why that movie failed is because the poster was a picture of Richard Pryor making a funny face, and people thought it was a comedy, when really he's like the third star of the film. You've got Keitel and Yaphet Kotto sharing screen time with him in this really dark union drama, and it failed because people thought it was a comedy. But he's amazing in it, and they didn't even mention that. They kept focusing on the comic roles. They didn't mention his role in California Suite. They didn't mention his cameo in Muppet Movie. Like, they really picked the big three that he had done at that point. But I think that's something that should have been a little bit more paid attention to as they're talking about his career, is he was actually a really good dramatic actor as well. And in my opinion, maybe had more dramatic chops than Murphy does.
When he goes into this, Ebert says something that really does upset me when it comes down to this, is Ebert says what Pryor owes us, if he owes us anything after this drug incident, is to be Richard Pryor. Now, this is kind of taking into what you said, is we stereotype these characters. We expect these characters. Richard Pryor doesn't owe us anything. If anything, he owes it to himself. This comment, even if I've taken it out of context, then I apologize. But if this is what Pryor thinks, if this is what Ebert thinks Pryor owes us, is to do roles that isn't good for him internally and mentally, and he is just expected to dance on stage as a performer, then that is completely wrong. For an actor to move forward, he needs to ensure that he is mentally there. He needs to ensure that he is healthy. And this is where we stereotype these characters. Even now, we have these characters that, like Adam Sandler, I'm using it as an example, does all these silly comedies, and then when he comes out with Uncut Gems, it's mind-blowing, but critics, there's a couple reviews out there that says this isn't an Adam Sandler movie. I can't not see Adam Sandler in a comedy. So, and that is totally on the critic, and we're seeing that kind of sneak through in these comments here, where we're expecting Richard Pryor to just dance for the camera, and that's what drives me crazy, even though I'm not saying every movie he did after this incident is great, because it's not, but at the same time, I applaud him for at least taking safe roles so he can progress, because he ended up doing Brewster's Millions, which I actually did love. Brewster's Millions. So sometimes these talents have to take a step back and choose some roles to get back into practice before they can knock one out of the ballpark. And I think that's what Pryor did here, because out of, I think, the 8-9 movies he did in that decade, he maybe had 3 good ones, I think. And to me, for an actor that pumps movies out every year to 2 years, that's a good ratio. And you're going to have some stinkers. But I think he was smart in picking these roles to better himself and to get back into the rhythm of where he was before that incident.
Well, and that's one of the things that bothers me too about critics and cinema pundits, where a dramatic actor or a very serious actor, for example, all of a sudden people think that Liam Neeson is hilarious. You know, he's going to be in the Naked Gun remake playing the Leslie Nielsen role. I mean, I'm here for it because all he has to do is just play himself. He just has to keep that tone and let the movie be funny around him. But dramatic actors or actors who are not known for comedy, they don't get as much of the pushback when they do comedic roles and succeed. On that same note, they also don't get as much pushback when they fail because people are like, oh, they're not comedic guys. They're just, out of their element. It's just not for them. Comedic actors, stand-up performers, they don't get the respect when they can actually show dramatic chops. They'll get what you just said. People will get their mind blown, but at the same time, they will get that response of like, oh, but I just can't shake Happy Gilmore out of my head. I can't hear the Adam Sandler voice. I can't watch Eddie Murphy in a dramatic performance after he's been Norbit, right? They have a much harder uphill battle to fight in that personal opinion and critical opinion in the way I see it and the way I've read these reviews for decades and heard people talk and done these kind of podcasts. It really is kind of a shame that critics fall into that same circular logic that a lot of these just bobbleheads who say, a stand-up comic really can't be a great performer when they don't give as much pushback to dramatic actors that take on comedic roles and maybe don't impress us.
More comedic actors, I think, in my opinion, have more success going from comedy to drama than anybody else. I mean, we take Adam Sandler, Jim Carrey, a long list of these comedians that have proven them to be worthy, because delivering comedy is all about timing. It's all about how you portray your character. That is a great foundation to be in a drama where you understand timing. You understand the difference between different scenes where you have to be completely goofy 10 minutes from now versus being serious there in the moment. So to me, comedy is very challenging, and comedians are more in tune with oneself than one that does dramatic roles over and over and over again, because that's when we get complacency. And just recently I saw Ryan Gosling in The Fall Guy, and to me that performance is really just stagnant because it's complacent. We can see that in the performance on it. And I think comedians have that step up on all these, even action stars like Liam Neeson that does the same action movie over and over again because it's the same damn performance. So this is where I think more comedians should step out of their shell, like Eddie Murphy or even Richard Pryor, to really prove people wrong. And it is an injustice for anybody to typecast these talents saying that they can't, or this isn't the character. Get over it, because this is beauty on screen. You're seeing the character and the talent evolve in film, and that should be a beautiful thing to see.
And I will go on record saying that even the biggest bombs of Richard Pryor, in my opinion, did not bomb because of Richard Pryor. They just weren't good movies. They weren't good scripts. Maybe they weren't handled properly with the marketing of the studio, or, the director just didn't know how to handle a talent like that. But they're not the faults of the stars. Hear No Evil, See No Evil, and Another You are not known for being great movies, but Pryor and Wilder are great in them. Sometimes that's just like the best you're going to get in a situation like that. It's like, I'm going to go watch this movie because I know that these two guys are going to make me laugh. The rest of the movie's probably going to suck, and sometimes they do, but it doesn't change the brilliance and the talent, like you just said, that these people bring to the screen.
He's proven he can sell a lot of tickets, but I'm not sure that that's all that good for his career. I think he ought to be taking more chances.
Absolutely. And, the film that we didn't mention is The Toy, which he was even worse in, and it was just boring. He's doing sort of like he has a perpetual hot foot. I hate to say it, but that's
and going around all the time just being a nice guy and taking care of little children.
This is one of the diseases that can happen to stars, and that is they can become very protective of their careers, and they don't want to play bad guys.
I get what they're trying to say with that, but you can't make that judgment in like the year or two after that incident and the roles he decided to take once he got better. So after he had the accident, he made Some Kind of Hero, The Toy, and Superman 3. Yeah, they're safe roles, but they were also money roles, Like when you're out of the limelight for a couple years and people are making jokes about you, the only way that you can really come out on top is just laugh with them, right? Talk about it in your stand-up and then do something that's going to get audiences in there. Some kind of hero, the toy in Superman 3, questionable movies on a critical point of view for most people. I actually happen to love the toy in Superman 3 nostalgically. I get that they're not great movies, but they made a lot of money. It put his name back out there and gave him the opportunity to make better films, which he did.
Yeah, to me, I think it was a brilliant choice. Now, as a kid, I loved the toy because I didn't really get all the context to it. I thought it had some cool toys and it was a fun storyline with a bratty kid.
Yeah, we wanted that room. We wanted the go-karts.
I wanted the
kid
peeing
had,
dog. But now watching as an adult, I see it. I mean, it really could have had a great family tone, a great family feel, and then enter the KKK. It just goes kind of bonkers.
It goes so
But
bonkers.
at the same time, I think they were actually pretty smart moves because who's going to turn down being in a Superman movie at that time? I mean, they're paychecks, but again, it's good publicity for Pryor to get back into the groove. The toy, I think, at the time may have been targeted for family, like a family film. I don't know. I can't remember. But you take a family film and a Superman film. To me, if I was his agent, I'd say take it because this is going to get you the screen time that you need and the recognition that you need, even though they bombed, even though the scripts aren't even 100% great. But I think this will bring audiences in and this will reignite your kind of career and catapult it. So I don't think they're not the great movies, but I think for him, it was a good career move at that time, just on paper, at least.
Right. And that's why I'm like, why are we shaming him for taking it a little bit safe? Right. You know, what are you going to do? You're going to just jump right back into that same mode that you were in the late 70s and early 80s. And this is the thing that I think critics, we've definitely noticed it with these two. Critics aren't the best social thermometers for when it comes to how politically things are changing throughout the time. I feel they're always like 3 or 4 years behind what's actually relevant and what's changing in the social climate. We definitely noticed it whenever we cover episodes that were in the late 70s or early 80s. I think All That Jazz was a perfect example where they were like saying, what happened to the musicals of the 50s and 60s? What is this real, like, thought-provoking, esoteric, almost psychedelic musical with open heart surgery? Like, they were not on point with what the audiences were wanting and what filmmakers were wanting to give us. I feel like as a critic, especially as big as they were, they really get stuck on looking at the exact same prestige and art house films that they've been impressing them and impressing audiences. And when people break that mold, it takes them several years to catch up with it. They hated Reservoir Dogs, but they thought that Pulp Fiction was the best film of the 90s. And it's only like a 3-year difference between the two of them. They just hadn't caught up with what 90s cinema was going to bring us. And I feel that is kind of where the opinions that they make like that kind of fall flat, because maybe they were looking for a performance or a film from Richard Pryor that just wasn't wanted by audiences anymore. And the studio knew well enough to transition him into something where at the dawn of the blockbuster, right? 83, 84, the studios were ready to start putting names like this in bigger films. It's not their fault. This is what the industry does. It'll push some of that shit aside so they can put the new blockbuster or whatever the new trend is. Is it going to be horror movies, zombie movies, then superhero movies? Like, they just weren't great at following the trend. They were always a little bit behind.
Yeah, and we talked about it earlier. I mean, just with the statement, he owes us, because this is where they want this talent to really bend to them. They want this talent to bend to the audience. And no matter what role, he can pick a dramatic role, an action role, or comedic role. But at the end of the day, they're going to go to that comedy piece of it and expect him to do that every single time. They expect the same level of comedy every single time, no matter what movie he's in. And that's just a completely unfair to any talent in Hollywood, especially during this time, because with the problem with critics, and I see it more often than not, it's impossible for a critic not to reference a movie in comparison. It's
Right.
impossible for a critic not to compare so-and-so to so-and-so. So who cares? Oh, face value, go to the movie just like an audience member was, or as a viewer is, and just take the movie at face value on how it made you feel. Don't think back to how Richard Pryor made you feel 2 movies ago, because it
Right.
doesn't matter. It's just an unfair criticism of how to look at a movie, and that's kind of what this back half of this episode really kind of got me a little bit,
Yeah.
because this is where they really start to be openly honest, and to an extent, I appreciate that. But it starts to have a big question mark on
Like, what's the
what
true
they
intent of
expect.
this? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of almost disappointing to me.
What
And
Eddie
it's
Murphy has, I think, is the same thing I saw back in 1975 with Richard Pryor in that little Western. A very wise and controlled smile that says, I know what's going on in the world, and what's going on in this movie. And that kind of wisdom was also apparent in Murphy's second film, Trading Places, in which he plays a street panhandler who strikes it rich when a couple of wealthy Philadelphians, 2 brothers, bet on whether Murphy will turn away from his life of petty crime if they set him up with his own chauffeur and high-paying job.
So now they've moved on to Eddie Murphy, talking about how great his debut performance in 48 Hours was, and it is. And it's just a good movie. Like, that's the thing. If it was a bad movie, would he get as much recognition? Probably not. Without Eddie Murphy, 48 Hours still works. It's a good crime comedy. Yes, the chemistry between Nolte and Murphy is what makes it, but it's also just a good movie and a good story with a good director and a great soundtrack. All of that works without it. So, yes, that opinion is a little bit biased, I think, on Gene's part. But when we talk about Trading Places, this is different now, because this is a film that's tailored to Eddie Murphy's talents, right? And it's tailored to what he can do with this performance. And we're still in that era of time, this early 80s, where racial humor, when done, I'm going to say with the right amount of inappropriateness, it's still on edge. It's not quite satirical as Blazing Saddles, but it's really, really close, where we are talking about the white elites of Philadelphia, the Wall Street people, the finance people, and then the homeless population. And bringing this homeless guy into that world to see if he can adapt and if he can succeed, or is it a genetic thing like they're trying to say. So that was perfectly tailored for him. And unlike 48 Hours, I don't see Trading Places working well with a performer besides Eddie Murphy.
Well, you need that energy to contradict Dan Aykroyd, because Dan Aykroyd plays a pretty
Right.
He's great in the role, but it is a safe, and that's what the character does require. So he needs somebody just out there, and I think it's hard to picture. It's one of those movies you can't picture anybody else but Eddie Murphy doing it. And I think when it comes down to it, most of Eddie Murphy's movies that we see, it's hard to picture anybody else with it, because he brings that energy to the table. He brings his own flair to it, his own spin to it. So I'm sure there's talent out there that could do the job, but can they do it to the level that Eddie Murphy shows the passion and the energy that he puts into each and every character? Because like Pryor, there is a level of personality of himself that goes into each and every character out of his comedic style, that you can walk into 48 Hours and Beverly's Hill Cop, and it's almost like looking at the same energy and the same character. It's just in a different situation. And the chemistry is going to twerk that a little bit. So I think when it comes to the choices of who they put in, the only thing I will kind of push back is the chemistry has to be there. When it comes to the Nolte and Eddie character, I'm sure they can put somebody else in there, but the chemistry has to be there. Without the chemistry in a buddy cop movie, you just have a well-written action flick. And I think that is extremely important to really have, because a lot of these action buddy cop movies, if you don't have chemistry, it just falls flat, and it is just boring to watch and a chore to watch from start to finish.
And I think after Trading Places, but especially Beverly Hills Cop, which was just 1 year later, I think that was the end of Eddie Murphy looking for roles and then people creating roles for Eddie Murphy, where I feel that Richard Pryor didn't have as much of that. If you look back at those films that he made in the early 80s to mid 80s, they really were kind of like insert comedic actor here. Brewster's Millions did not have to be Richard Pryor. It just didn't, but Beverly Hills Cop, which was supposed to be Stallone, and that didn't fall through, so Eddie Murphy took over. You can't imagine Beverly Hills Cop now without Eddie Murphy. And then after being the hit that it was, every role was tailored after that. He's got Coming to America, Beverly Hills Cop 2. Then you go into Harlem Nights where the ego is there and he's making his own stuff. Another 48 Hours, and then into the 90s where he's just got that killer lineup of Boomerang, Distinguished Gentleman, and then Beverly Hills Cop 3 is like that downward fall of like, okay, what am I going to do until Nutty Professor comes and saves my career because I can play all these different characters. I'm not to say that the guy made bad career decisions. I mean, he's a multi-millionaire with a huge resume of impressive stuff. Those latter day bombs, I feel, aren't enough to ruin his legacy. Like I said earlier, it is a shame that he's still being judged for those when new projects come out. It's almost like it scared him away a little bit from taking new things on. Like Dolomite. Dolomite was so good. It should have been an award-winning, I don't care what kind of award, because you know how I feel about awards, but there's something different about that word-of-mouth reaction that people have, and then true recognition from your peers, whether it's the Screen Actors Guild, whether it is the Associated Press, or even the Oscars. Sandler has to deal with it too, and it's sad because I feel like he does do a lot of great stuff. But I get what they're saying now, where is it really the thing about these are just comedians that are being held to a certain expectation of you have to be funny or else your movie doesn't work? Because it almost sounds like that's what they want and not wanting them to grow and discover what else they can do in their film craft.
Well, and the one thing I think we're missing is how many times did Murphy pick up the phone to a creator or a screenwriter or a director, casting director, whatever it may be, and say, I wrote this role just for you. I wrote this role with you in mind. And this role is tailored to Murphy, where not a lot of people can pull it off. And, if you have Stallone and Beverly Hills Cop, that to me, I can't visualize it because to me, that would just turn into an action flick. But when you have a role that's designed mainly for you in mind, and you see that all the time in Hollywood, even back in the 80s, then you need to get this guy. You need to convince Murphy to take this role. The paychecks get bigger. The desperation is there without going through rewrites or character redesigns. So to me, that may have played a bigger part in a lot of these choices, a lot of whispering in the ears for him to take these roles as the paychecks got bigger. If I were to assume in the moral just of Hollywood of how things rolled out. So that would be my opinion on a lot of these decisions. Putting it directly on Murphy picking these roles, I wouldn't say would be 100% fair because there are things happening in the background. And a lot of these roles, it's hard to picture these being written just as a guideline or a generic character for anybody to take on. These were designed for Murphy, and you cannot convince me otherwise.
Well, and also the ego trip, in the 90s, he started messing around with like trying to be a singer as well and doing all these little extracurricular activities that, I mean, the dude recorded Party All the Time and then the What's Up With You with Michael Jackson. Those are definitely highly parodied songs that people play in karaoke and stuff like that, so there is something about the ego. Bruce Willis did it too when he put out his blues album, right? Like it gets to some people, but they're performers, man. And you have to have an ego if you want to be a successful actor, movie star, TV star, whatever. Like humility is great, but humility also doesn't get you the roles and the money and the clout that these guys got, because humility, if you sit there and wait for the right role and you're just waiting for the phone to ring, well, then like you're an Al Pacino, you're a Bill Murray in his later years, where I'm going to let the role find me and I'll do something great with it. Where high energy guys, they don't have that. They don't have that in their head. Or I don't want to wait for the phone to ring. I need to make things happen. Put me in a music video. Get me on a record. Get me doing this. And unfortunately, if it's not good, you are going to be judged for those throughout your career. And I think that just never really settled with Eddie Murphy. He still is kind of bitter about it.
Well, and I think there's a difference between ego and confidence, and you see a lot of successful like De Niro or Pacino that have a confidence, and to have that confidence of not being worried when the phone's going to ring again, that's going to be the
Right.
difference. But when we have talent that wait by the phone's not ringing because you don't have a movie that's designed or you're not expected to do the movie that they want you to do, it gets into a panic, and we can say it's ego, and I guarantee there is a lot of ego, but at the same time, there could be a subtle fear of if I don't take this role, it's been 2 years since my last one. This is my shot. I need to take something. And there is a fear, even with the most egotistical people, with the most overly confident people. You can't tell me that if you sit on without a project for 2 years, that you get that eagerness to take something. So, and I think Murphy, he has a confidence. He knows how talented he is, but it got the best of him when it came to what roles came to him. Because I can only imagine the roles that he turned down in the past. I mean, even Ghostbusters at one point during a lot of his early days that came out that didn't work out as well. So there's probably a lot of projects out there that he didn't take because he didn't believe in it and he didn't believe in the actual direction or if it was written for him.
I mean, in 1 year span, he put out Pluto Nash, I Spy, Daddy Daycare, and The Haunted Mansion. That was all in a year span. So the early 2000s, man, like I really feel that was like the desperation period of his career. I don't look down on him for any of that. You know, people make bad movies all the time. I don't think people go into a production knowing that it's bad just to take it. There are people like Eric Roberts who will never turn down a paycheck, but they always bring 100% of the energy to it. But I mean, on paper, I Spy, a remake of a popular TV show from the 60s. On paper, that should work. Daddy Take Care, I don't know about that. But Haunted Mansion, Disney property. On paper, that should work. It's not their fault that they didn't. They have such low scores and such low box office returns. Again, I don't think that's Eddie Murphy's fault, but he has to carry that on his shoulders. And maybe that's the thing that I could consider my closing statement on the thesis of this particular subject of this episode is they're looking at it as Pryor handing the torch to Murphy and Murphy taking that torch with him of like, okay, we have the two funniest African American comedians making really great movies right now, but are they going to ever truly be like respected as actors if they keep doing funny, hokey movies or safe movies? Gene mentions in the episode, I didn't record it, where he's like, people gave him a lot of flack for making a comparison in one of his written articles that the only reason why he was making comparisons between these two performers is because they were both African American. And he's like, actually, that's one of the reasons, because it's true. There weren't more popular African American comedians making films this big in the early 80s. So that is a valid point. But the point that he was really trying to make is Pryor going to just continue this path of safer comedies, and is Murphy going to pick up the torch that Pryor left behind of doing more dangerous and edgy comedies that he didn't have to play the sidekick, where he could play the main character? And as we saw in later years, 100% he did. We got Coming to America being like something he actually had control of the story. And his films in the 90s, those were Eddie Murphy movies. He wasn't sharing the title with another actor, a Caucasian actor. So Gene got his wish. It did come true for the most part. But for Pryor didn't have to face that long downfall that Eddie Murphy's had to deal with, because he just took a lot less roles. And before I finalize my little say on this, is JoJo Dancer is, to me, one of the most underrated dramas of the 80s, where Richard Pryor essentially made an autobiography about himself. He essentially did the All That Jazz, or Bob Fosse's Lenny, but he played JoJo Dancer, which was the film version of Richard Pryor. it's a little heavy-handed in some of its moments and melodramatic, but his performance and the rawness that he brings to him telling his story of like a rise and fall of success and the struggle to get back up on top again, and drugs and womanizing and cheating and all those different things that might be, a little bit embellished for dramatic reasons. I wish that that film had come out when they did the special so they could see what he was capable of, what he was trying to do with his clout in the industry at that time, and being able to tell that story, because I think that would have been like the blowing out the candle on Gene's statement of where his career was going to end up.
Yeah, and I agree with you take out the drugs and the cheating, and I felt the same way about Daddy Daycare with Eddie Murphy. So, I mean, these two, there's no question that these two are just legends no matter with what they do. I mean, they can pick a bad movie, and even if they told me I did it intentionally, I won't frown upon them because every talent deserves to do a project that they enjoy doing. If they picked it for enjoyment, more power to him. I know a couple episodes I gave Tommy Lee Jones props for doing Man of the House. I mean, at one point in your career, you can pick those bad movies, even with the intent that it's going to be bad. And you can't tell me that Daddy Daycare on paper wasn't a bad movie, because it was. There's no question about it. But Eddie Murphy, whether it was for a paycheck or just to act with another director or to act with another cast member, he did that project for a reason. And I'm not even going to put the paycheck comment in there, because if he did it for a paycheck, so what? We take jobs for paycheck. He's a human too. So that more power to him on that one as well. But these two will make a dent in all comedy and Hollywood for years to come. Pryor and Murphy have deserved their time in the limelight, and even if Murphy comes out with another flop, guess what? I'm still going to see it, and I'm still going to go to it with an open mind because I respect that man so much on what he has given to the viewers across all over the world. So he's made some great stuff, and the bad stuff should never overpower the work that he's done that really made an impact on the film industry.
So I think my last question for you before we end this episode is, we have the Richard Pryor to Eddie Murphy passing off the torch as these two are covering in this special. Who do you think that there has been a performer that has taken that lead after Eddie Murphy? I mean, I hate to say this on a racial basis, but that's the whole point of this episode is there another African-American comedian or comedic performer that has really kind of taken the reins of the Eddie Murphy-like status when it comes to the comedy, when it comes to the film and the success? Because I have a couple in mind, but the difference is, does financial success of their films have the same relevance to me as the legacy and the importance and the resonance of the film? Anything can make money these days and anything can lose money. But do any of these people who supposedly may have taken the reins from these two guys, have they made any films that actually have made a social impact and people will talk about in 20 years?
Well, here's the deal. There is tremendous talent out there, but the answer is no. And it's not because of the talent. It's because of what kind of movies are coming out now, how safe movies are. Mm-hmm. Comedy is dead. I know you listened to my Ricky Stanicki review where that is the most risque kind of comedy that we've seen in years. We don't get comedy. We don't have the material to let these comedians shine. So there is nothing out there to really forte a lot of these talents, from comedies to comedy rom-coms to even dramas at this point that are just becoming complacent. The material out there right now doesn't put a seat at the table for a lot of up-and-coming talent. And that is an absolute shame, because that's when we run into a lot of not only just generic material that we see over and over again, but it puts a shadow on a lot of these up and coming talents that we may never see, that they're out there. And I think that is the most frustrating thing for me when I go to every single movie every week, is I can sit there and listen to the words and just listen to the dialogue and say that is cut and pasted from 4 different movies. The material is just way too safe, and there is we need creators to set the foundation to really take it forward, to give a road and a roadmap to these comedians to really come out of their shell and show what they can do on the big screen.
Agreed 100%. So I'm going to put you on the spot really fast. Favorite Richard Pryor movie and favorite Eddie Murphy movie?
I have to go with Stir Crazy is going to be the right answer for me, but See No Evil, Hear No Evil. I can watch that chemistry all day. It has some fantastic moments in it. So those two, but Stir Crazy has to be my favorite. When it comes to Eddie Murphy, this one's tough. I would have to say Trading Places is up there, but I think his performance in Life was a good transition for him, and it was just an outstanding, just a fantastic movie. So I think it was different, and it doesn't get the recognition that it deserves.
I agree with you 100% on Life. I think Life is so underrated, and I'm not a huge Martin Lawrence fan, but he works for me in that movie. That chemistry is actually really, really good. So I would say that. For me, Stir Crazy 100% for Richard Pryor. And I'm sorry, but I cannot say that Coming to America is not my favorite Eddie Murphy movie. It just 100% is, because it's all him. You know, it's got a lot of great side pieces. Arsenio's hilarious. John Amos is hilarious. And just everything about that movie works. John Landis really knows how to direct Eddie Murphy, but that one, even though he's not at his unleashed most hilarious, it did let us see a different side of him. You know, we're now, okay, Eddie Murphy can play the romantic lead. He's actually quite charming. I really, really like this guy. He's not loud, obnoxious Axel Foley. So I will always say Coming to America is my favorite.
It's a good pick. That's a fantastic movie, too. I mean, there's just so much with both of these two that it's hard to pick from, because I can watch these two in anything and they're just standouts. So good pick.
Awesome, man. Well, this was great. I can't wait to do more of these episodes where we jump into their like little special presentations, because there's so many good ones. And, you know, it's nice to get a break from watching these movies every week and talking about the movie and breaking it down and talking about them at their most honest, right? They're not critiquing a film in this. They're literally critiquing performers and their entire careers, which is brazen. It's really brazen for a critic to do that and have to wade through the performances that they really, really like, knowing that there's a lot of garbage in there too. I mean, it's still early for Eddie Murphy on this one, but yeah, it's a lot of fun to kind of get off the beaten path and talk about these special episodes.
Just love the conversation, because it's just great just talking about the talents that we've had numerous experiences and spent hours with. And not only that, but hearing some critics be vulnerable and just talk about their experiences with the movie, even though not in full agreement. But at the same time, it's good to see that different side of a journalist come to light.
Absolutely. So next week, we are going to be diving into a film that Justin brought, which, you know what? I love you, man. And there's times where I can't wait to watch the movie that you've suggested. And then there's ones like this that I know I've seen and I know I'm going to struggle with, but I'll go in with an open mind and you might change it. We're watching If Looks Could Kill with Richard Grieco.
Yes.
And when you put that on the list, I was about to just shut down the podcast.
I love to throw in those movies just to poke the bear. And this one I am stoked for. And I'm completely stoked for the conversation on this one, because this movie holds dear to my heart. But again, we'll see what you think after the rewatch.
I bet. If I come out of this next episode liking this movie, I'm going to name my next kid after you, because it's going to be like a miraculous thing. But we'll see. Like I said, open mind. So once again, everybody, thank you for tuning into this very special episode. Make sure you join us next week. Please like us on all of your pod platforms, rate, review, subscribe, follow us on YouTube, share, and like we've done before, if there are any people that have suggestions for films that Siskel and Ebert talked about on their podcast that we haven't gotten on our list, throw it out there and we will put it on our list right away. Once again, I'm Antonio, host of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast, with my co-host,
Justin Henson of the Movie Wire Podcast.
You can find us on our respective websites. I'm on thecultworthy.com. He's on themoviewire.com, and we will see you next week.